Okay, told you we're laying down bits and pieces. Some of these festivals will look at a word. Sometimes there'll be a conclusion, sometimes there'll be no conclusion. It's a piece of information being put into the equation. So if you remember, a couple of weeks back, we looked at the Greek word parousia. And so tonight I want us to look at this word apocalypsis, which is where we get our English word for apocalypse. It's really not too much to say on this word. I mean, there's kind of some weird things that I dug up, but I don't really think they're relevant, except to say kalupto, because it's a compound, apo and kalupto put together. Kalupto, you find that Calypso, the goddess of the underworld, that's in ancient literature. But in Indo-European, this would be hiding or burying, general sense of to conceal or to cover. So if you put the apo to that and join it to the word, apo can be of a place or time, motion away from, position apart from, origin, material of an individual, can be used as an adverb. But in a compound, apokalupto, you'd have either away, off, completing, ceasing. So when you put the two together, you have to uncover, to disclose, to reveal. Apokalypsis, to uncover. We say in English apocalypse or revelation. Not really too much there that you'd say, wow, gee, I didn't know that. I didn't add these up, but they're in the Greek, you've got it 18 times as a noun and 26 times as a verb. Not that that's going to mean anything to you just yet. So when we use the word apocalypse, we tend to think immediately of the book of Revelation. And rightly so, but you're going to find that word peppered throughout, sometimes to be translated by the King James translators as manifested or to be revealed. They're not always consistent. Some examples where you'll find this word pertaining to Christ exactly. 1 Corinthians, I think it's 1:7. And I'm just spouting stuff off the top of my head, which is dangerous. Really dangerous at this hour. Let's see. First Corinthians. So that you come behind in no gift, waiting for the coming. That is our word. You've got it elsewhere in 1 Peter, multiple times in 1 Peter, in fact. Wherefore, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, hope to the end for the grace that is to be brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So we tend to equate this word in a New Testament way. But you'd be surprised when you start to dig, and especially when you start to do analysis of text, you find that certain words that we think are so New Testament are really not so New Testament. I'll give you an example. The word mystery. Many times Paul says the mysteries of God, or he says in Thessalonians the mystery of iniquity, mysterion. We tend to think that is just flat out a New Testament concept, but it's not. So as I started to get into the text of Revelation, I wanted to give you an example sometimes of how one would analyze a text to show that we can't just always depend on a New Testament passage and think that there is not some place where it connects to the Old. And I'm not just talking about contextually, but linguistically. And a perfect example, if you'll turn there with me, will be if you turn to Daniel 2. And let's take a look at what happens there. in Daniel 2. And then after I do this segment, I'm just going to read just straight Bible reading to you. Daniel 2, and let's begin at verse 19. And I want you to underline a couple of things as we go. See if I can't find my papers to get my stuff in order here. Here we go. Then was the secret revealed. Secret revealed, underline that. Then read on in verse 22. He revealeth the deep and secret things. So we're looking at revealeth secret things. You can underline that. In 2:28, but there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets. In 2:29, and he that revealeth secrets. And then again in 2:30, but as for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have. So you can get an idea, and it keeps going, by the way. I'll just give you what's in the second chapter. There's more. But in the second chapter, in the 47th verse, the king answered unto Daniel and said, of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets. Now, each time that appears, this may absolutely mean nothing to you. All right, so in 2:19, you have mysterion apokalypse. 2:22, apokalypte. 2:28, apokalypton mysteria. So you can see these words are really, they're in the text. Now obviously I'm using the Septuagint, and you see there's a notation that says Theodotion. That's my abbreviation, Theod. May be different in some verses. So let's talk about this for a minute and why this is important. When we begin to analyze a text, there's several things that have to be there. And this is where a concept of language is important. See, we might read the King James Daniel 2, and we might not see these things, and we disconnect things that are being said in Daniel 2 that are essentially being said throughout Revelation. And when we see linguistically how they line up, although people are going to argue and say, well, but you're using the Septuagint. That's the Greek version of the Hebrew text. And for this particular example, yes. Now, it's well known and well documented that from Daniel 2:4 to Daniel 7:28, I believe, is in Aramaic. So I'm going to try and strip this back for a second to say why I use the Septuagint to give you an example tonight of an analysis of the word appearing somewhere. First of all, you've got to go back as far as you can when you start doing research. Forget about your NIV and your NLT and your BLT. Just you got to go back as far as you can. And we know unequivocally that, and there's good reason, by the way. People have argued this, why is some part of it in Hebrew and some part of it in Aramaic? And for me, it's to a point, it's self-evident, to a point. Then there's I want to say about a chapter and a half that doesn't make any sense of why it's in Aramaic, but the bulk of it makes sense to me, and I'll tell you why I have this propensity to believe something a certain way. But we know that you've got Hebrew, Aramaic, Hebrew. And if you try and go back as far as you can, the Masoretic text limits us to the most extant that we have will be 1,000, in the year 1000, we'll call it 1000 and something to be sure. Let's call it 1100, even though that's a late date, but that's AD, as far back as the Masoretic text can go. You've got to go back even further, and for a lot of people who don't look at these things, they'll say, well, for example, the people who date Daniel to a later time and say it's nothing but something that was just made up later because there's so much history in it that it has to be later. But if you confront them with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Daniel portions of the Dead Sea Scroll, now you got a problem. It can't be later because the Dead Sea Scrolls are earlier. Now they're not extant, but the fragments that we have, the bulk of them, believe it or not, lining them up with the Masoretic text, they're pretty close. They're pretty close. They're not exact, but they're pretty close. Using the Septuagint, we know we can go back at least, we'll call it 200 to 300 years BC, somewhere in that ballpark, using the Septuagint. And then you jump forward to the time of Origen, who produced the Hexapla, which I just am kicking myself that I did not bring this in tonight to show you, which I've shown you before. Hexapla, 6 columns. And in his Hexapla, he does something very strange. When he gets to Daniel, there's a whole shift that it's uncharacteristic of why he did this. And the whole pattern of what he did in his Hexapla is abandoned with Daniel. And I think, with all due respect, probably there's so much complexity to this. You get to somebody like Jerome, and Jerome says, well, we can't use the Septuagint when it comes to Daniel because it's unreliable and it doesn't match up with the Masoretic text, therefore let's toss the baby out with the bathwater. And failure to understand one most important tool in all of this makes everything just go south. So Aramaic is not a dissimilar language from Hebrew. What does need to be understood is that Aramaic was, why you like to use the term, the lingua franca, if you will, of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And most people don't understand that. They think that that language must be more akin or more used by, we'll call them the Hebrew children, right? Or the Jews. I don't like to use the second because that brings confusion. The Hebrew people. And what you end up with is a lack of understanding that in the family tree of languages, Aramaic is closely related. It's, we'll call it like, you know, it's a brother from another mother. How's that? Closely related somewhat. Many words that are the same. Some words will be interpreted differently, and slight variance on pronunciation. But when you pass the language through, think about this, this language has several layers in it. We tend to think one-dimensional, but think just about like English, how English developed over time. Aramaic has the same developmental periods. You've got early, now they're not broken up into neat categories, but you've got it going back as far as the Assyrian realm forward and the language of the empire. So it's a given that you're going to have what English has with loanwords, Aramaic would have with other Semitic branches of the tree. So this is why when people get into things, and then of course some parts of the order of the books or their verses are out of order or slightly longer, then people say, well, I can't deal with this. So my decision was I was going to use the Septuagint tonight. I will bring in the Hexapla so you can see it. It's helpful to visually see what happens when you get to Daniel and how it shifts. But the good thing is that any one of these combinations is not going to be so far off that we can't piece together and make some semblance and some understanding. So the reason why I did what I did with this is to show you that even to the Septuagint, which, if we're going to stray away from that for a minute, fast forward to about the year 160 with, there's Aquila in Origen's Hexapla. There's Aquila, Symmachus, Theodotion. You've got Origen's, you've got the Septuagint itself. So you've got other translations from the Hebrew into the Greek that were done for other reasons other than what the Septuagint would be functioning as. In other words, when people who were not Christians found out that the Christians were using the Septuagint, suddenly the Septuagint was no longer appealing. So they had to have their own version that wasn't the version of the Christian. It's very petty, but anyway, whatever. So because there were influences, there were messianic influences, there were words being used that perhaps in another realm would not be used. So the point of this is to show you that when we get into translation, we have to be very mindful of the language. We have to be mindful of the setting. And then we have to think a little bit of when John is writing, and we're going to actually, later on this evening, we'll go into Revelation 1. I'm going to kind of show you what I was working out and share it with you. But we're going to see that when God speaks, he's essentially saying the same thing, and he may be using different mouths or different hands to write, but you've got very similar things being said in similar ways. So when people talk about the authenticity of Daniel or the authenticity of the book of Revelation, the one thing you can be sure of is in a linguistic analysis, which always pays off big time, you will find that there's good evidence. I don't want to use the word influence because that sounds like, well, John was influenced by Daniel. But there's good reason to say that there is linguistic influence there. Let's just leave that one for a minute because somebody might say, okay, don't belabor me with this. Now, I'll give you a perfect case in point. I just made a very straightforward example of this to show you the difference between Daniel 2:28 in the Septuagint and Revelation 1:1. And this is going to be difficult because even if I lean there, well, let's see. If I put my glasses on, I might be able to see my chicken scratch. Let's see. Let's go for it. There we go. So Daniel 2:28, we have the Greek eduloste ade genistai. So that top line right there, which is being translated, he showed what things must take place in the latter days. And in Revelation 1:1, you have to show things which must shortly come to pass. And I don't know if you can see the ade, we'll say it like English person speaking, day, geneste, right? Wow, that was like a crazy sound. So if you can, let's see if I can do this. It's always difficult to, let's do it this way here. See that a de geneste? A de geneste. So you can see the linguistic similarities. Now, what I noticed from this is something very important. The change from Daniel's words in the latter days to John's, there's a Greek two words, in taxe, shortly come to pass, is full of purpose. Think about this. Daniel, we're going to say, is writing minimally some 600 years before John. If John wrote in the 90s, and if Daniel wrote somewhere in the 600s, we'll just say 600 plus years, somewhere like that, Daniel was looking at the very distant latter days. John's declaration, the things which must shortly come to pass, what must be fulfilled, which ties into Revelation 1:19, right? The things which thou hast seen, the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter. In other words, it's like stringing two things together. Daniel's saying the things that pertain to the latter days, and now here's John taking up the same type of speech, saying the things that which must come to pass. And I'll address this come to pass shortly because I've done an analysis of 1:1, which was kind of fun. But what I'm trying to say to you is that you can see patterns. So when people try to say there is no correlation, or, okay, we've got pictures and types that are presented in Daniel, we've got corresponding in Revelation, but we've also got language. And why I'm saying this is an absolute must understand this is, remember, John is writing, he's being told write, and we have John's gospel to compare the style, some of the words that he regularly uses, and some words that he never uses. And so in all of this, there's that analysis that has to take place. Let's do this. I'm going to go out of order. We're going to do something out of order. As I started us in Daniel, and now I'm talking about Revelation. And so let's do this. Let's take a look then at what's going on in Revelation 1:1. And then we'll go back to Daniel. And we'll see if I can read my own writing from afar. But I want you to take a look, if you can read that with me. We have Apocalypsis Jesu Christu. What I want you to see, the first thing I want you to see right there, so I'm analyzing 1:1. What I put above there is the revelation of Jesus Christ. And I want you to take a look. The revelation of Jesus Christ, to uncover, disclose, reveal. Revelation, here's the important thing, given by or from Jesus Christ. That is a subjective genitive. This isn't about a revelation about Jesus, which is what the Gospels tell us. This is essentially an uncovering, an unveiling, a revealing something from or by Jesus to. Now keep reading down. Which God gave unto him. There's an interesting pattern. I had not even seen this until I started analyzing piece by piece. Which God gave unto him to show unto his servants. It's all morphologically tagged. That may mean nothing to some of you out there going, what is that? To show unto his servants is to show unto his slaves. See, Dr. Scott was right. I remember when he was teaching on Romans and he translated that word, man, that made some people so mad, especially one of the brothers in this church who left because Dr. Scott taught that that meant slaves, and that's exactly what that means, but it's not meant in the pejorative context that we have used it in this country. To be a slave of Jesus Christ is high and dignified. So let's take a look at that. The things which must shortly come to pass. And I put underneath there things which have to happen in or with speed. This should not be understood as quickly as in the sense of how soon, but rather the things that when they happen will happen quickly. So a lot of times people will read stuff and they'll say, but okay, but this, which must shortly come to pass, which sounds like, well, okay, we're in the year 2016 and John might have, let's push this to the late date of 96 or 98 AD. Well, shortly come to pass, if you've got a shortly come to pass that's taken all this time, you got a problem. Or you read it exactly the way I've translated. Things which have to happen. And I'm trying to make it as colloquial as possible so that the simplest meaning is understood. That when these things happen, they will happen quickly. And you might say, well, wait a minute, Pastor. Beginning, hypothetically, let's go on a traditional mindset that the 4th chapter, the church, essentially John is like the church enraptured, and the 6th chapter begins the opening of the seals, which begins the 7-year period. Well, that's much shorter and much quicker than, 1990 some or whatever, 80 years, whatever it is. So you have to put it in proper context. But let me go to the next one, see if we can, and we'll see if we can read that too, and then I'll tell you something that became clear to me. So take a look at that. And he sent and signified it by his angel unto his servant John. I want you to take a look at something. You see that second word I've circled, esimenin, which is very typical John. If you remember, I taught out of John Simeon. Signs, miracles, wonders, very typical. Little Scott, Liddell, Scott, lexicons, show by a sign. So I want you to think about that. When you read this, and he sent and signified it by his angel, I want you to think, forgive me for doing this, but it's probably the easiest way to think about this. He signified it. He gave signs. This book is full of signs, if you will, by his angel unto his servant John. And, well, it's actually unto his slave of him, John. So I want you to line this up and take a look at how this happens in your Bibles, because you don't really tend to think of it this way. You've got, and the translators added the revelation, but you've got, it makes sense for us in English to begin the sentence that way, although technically speaking, I hate to do this, if we were going to be a stickler about it, it would be indefinite, although I'm not making it indefinite, I'm just saying, technically speaking, it would be. There's no definite article there. However, I'm still using the to make sense of this. So think about this. The thing that is being uncovered or revealed from Jesus Christ, not about Jesus Christ, because we already know about Jesus Christ from John's Gospel, who told us everything we could possibly know about Jesus, beginning with, calling him the Word and calling him the Lamb of God, everything. So that's about. But this is an unfolding from or by Jesus. And there's this mind that says, I want you to watch this, that God gave to him, to who? To Jesus, to show unto his servants, his slaves, the things that have to happen, and when they do, they will happen quickly. And he sent and signified, made signs, or we'll call it show by sign, by his angel unto his servant. There's multiple, it's almost, think of the way this opens. I never really, until I started analyzing it, it's almost like a passing of the baton. This is not just one straightforward, cut and dry. We tend to read this and we think, okay, and then here's John, this apparition to him, Alpha and Omega, in the form of Jesus Christ, and we tend to think there's nothing in the middle. But in fact, right from the get-go, we have this unveiling from or by Jesus Christ, which God gave to him, not John, Jesus, to show unto his servants, his slaves, the things which have to happen. And he sent, and let's put it this way, he gave signs and miracles, or put it on display by his angel unto his servant John. Think about that. It's not just as straightforward as we think. And you might say, well, wait a minute. What are you talking about? I just thought this was a one-deal wonder here. You added multiple voices. No, I didn't. They're there. Go to the end of the book. If I can ever get to the end of my book. You go to the end of the book. (22) and verse 6. And he said unto me, these sayings are faithful and true, and the Lord God of the holy prophets sent his angels to show unto his servants the things which must shortly be done. And then you're going to find the same thing again. And I, John, saw these things and heard them, and when I had heard and seen, I fell down to worship before the feet of the angel which showed me these things. So this is what is fascinating. When you really begin to study, you'll find that there's one more that I left out here. 16 is probably the most important one. I, Jesus, have sent mine angel to testify unto you these things in the churches. So when we get into studying Revelation, I have to say this the right way, we're going to have to try and distinguish at times who's talking and who's doing what. Here, at the beginning, we have very clearly, I am the Alpha and the Omega. And then in chapter 5, it goes to the Lamb. And we've got different speakers. So I would just want to make that sure from the beginning that when we get into this, and I say certain things, you don't go, wait a minute, multiple speakers here? Yes, multiple speakers. And we tend to just read very sloppily and not pay attention to that. But the very opening of the book, in the Greek, gives a clear picture. Even in the English, it's kind of clear. I mean, you can't miss it. But my goal is that I don't know that I will do this for every single verse, but when there's something like this, I'll stop and I'll line it up so we can take a look, and I will do it in a darker ink so that maybe some of you, if you if we can get it in a darker ink, and I don't have to rewrite it because I work on a computer, but I write everything by hand, do all my notes in my own handwriting. So if we can get it dark enough, I may actually make it available to you. Somebody can make it. Can you guys make this thing dark?
Yes, ma'am.
Good. Then we'll make it available to you after they check that I haven't put anything gooey in there or done something weird. But that's when I say to you analysis of a text, that's when I saw in there, in the 1:1 where it says, things, I'm going to read from the King James, which must shortly come to pass. And went to check that out in Greek, I saw the parallel to Daniel 2:28 in the Septuagint and saw the connection immediately. For example, and you'll see other connections. Daniel's told to seal up these things. It's not for him to know these things. He says, what does this mean? I'm so perplexed about what I've heard or what I've seen. Seal it up. And then, of course, the next time we encounter something being unsealed, we're headed from the 5th into the 6th chapter of Revelation. So you can always see that there will be patterns that flow through the whole thing. So I'm not only looking at how to tie together the passages themselves, as in historically or representational, but when there is something in the language itself, I'm going to bring it to you so you can start making these connections because they do become very important. Now, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to go back into Daniel, and we're going to do some perplexing question asking about why Hebrew, Aramaic, Hebrew. Now, I'm not going to answer the whole thing, but I'll at least answer it in part. It might make sense to you. All right. Daniel. And the big question people want to ask is everything in here in order in the book? And I'd have to say that there may be a couple of sections that may not be in order. That won't hurt anything, by the way. What is important is you've got the Hebrew section, which supposedly begins the book, and then stops at 2:3. Now something happens. So let's go to the beginning. I told you we're going to do a lot of reading. Too many books open. I'm kind of trying to figure out which goodies I want to read from. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. We're getting a little bit of history right now. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, remember we covered this in other passages out of Jeremiah, and when we were going through Nehemiah, the beginning of Nehemiah, we were lining up all these things that happened in their chronology. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, and that's very important that these vessels are carried away, because it will be these vessels, by the way, that the next king after, or it may be, depending on your historical chronology, the next king after or the king after that, Belshazzar and his feast is drinking out of these vessels in his feast. We'll talk about that in another festival. Which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. So we have a setting that's happening right now. Now I want to, that's to try and get us to get to where we're going. And the reason why the beginning part is to give us some frame of reference. So think Hebrew. Now suddenly there's a shift, and I'm jumping, because otherwise we'll be here all night, I'll be reading all night. I'm jumping to the 2nd chapter now. In the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him. Then the king commanded to call the magicians, and the astrologers, and the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans, for to show the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king, still in Hebrew. The king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. Here begins the Aramaic, and there's a good reason why. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac. It says it right there. Well, think about it. Well, why, if you're writing something, you might think, well, doesn't it make sense that you would write the whole thing through in Hebrew? But something happens, and the reason why I really believe that this transition not only occurs because then they spake to the king, but to whom is this section of what is going to happen? To whom is it going to be addressed? It is not having to deal with, forgive me for saying it this way, the Jews and thy people. That's later. The dream and the interpretation of the dream, Daniel's going to speak to the king, and he's going to address it in the language they would have spoken. Now, all of my theory holds really good until you get into the later chapters, and then it's a little bit like, well, handwriting on the wall, that makes sense. Daniel in the lion's den, think about it. If you were going to be thrown into the lion's den and you wanted people to know, or the 3 that were in the fiery furnace, and you wanted those heathen folks to know, you'd write it in a language they could understand. Makes perfect sense. Where this falls apart a little bit is beginning in chapter 7, where you talk about the 4 beasts and the ram and the goat, and by the time you get to the ram and the goat, now you're back into Hebrew, and then Daniel prays for his people, which makes sense that that would be in Hebrew, and by the time you get into the 70 weeks, and it says, determined upon thy people. So we've got a shift. It's hard for me to explain a chapter and a half that doesn't make sense for it to remain in Aramaic, but that's the way I understand why it's divided like that. The things that are pertaining to his people are in Hebrew, and the things that are pertaining to these heathen / whatever you want to call them people, they're in Aramaic, in the language that they would have been more familiar with or more commonly used. Now you might say, well, how do you line all this up? Okay, so, and I had to write this down to make sure that I would get this straight for you. Old Aramaic was adopted by the Neo-Assyrian Empire. That was the lingua franca of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. So that spanned the time, certainly the Babylonian Empire, because that's the one we're dealing with right now. And then you can break this down. Old Aramaic, you've got Old or Ancient Aramaic, Imperial Aramaic, the post-Achaemenid Aramaic, late Old Eastern Aramaic, and late Western Aramaic. So you've got a very broad span of this language. So if that gives any help, don't ask me about the chapter and a half that's like where the other dollar went. I don't know why. But that seems to be the most plausible thing that I can possibly think of. Now let's go back to the 2nd chapter, because I was reading and then, of course, I stopped at the 4th verse. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. Tell us what you dreamed, and we'll tell you what it means. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. I love this. If you will not make known unto me the dream with the interpretation thereof, not just making known the dream, but the interpretation, but you got to tell me. I'm not telling you anything. You better tell me. I'm not telling you. You understand? You're going to tell me. I'm not telling you. You shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. Nothing worse. I mean, I've not had too much exposure, thank God. The people that, you know, they want to play at church, or they want to play at prophecy. You know, people, there's somebody who fancies themselves a prophet, and they always have a word from the Lord. You know, they want to tell you something. I mean, I think about what Dr. Scott explained about Claire Grace, who's probably one of the few people that Dr. Scott actually received something from, and received it for exactly what it was, because she told him something not just one thing, but multiple things that he was actually going through that no one else could have known about. And when you get that precision, you pay attention. But there's way too many of these types, by the way, in the church that run around. They want to tell you, they want to, tell us, and then we'll tell you. Like the people who are always speaking in tongues. I'm sorry, this is going to be so bad, but I always just wanted to be a plant somewhere in a room, where they were having a Pentecostal hoedown and go in there and just, start bubbling off, not speaking in tongues, just bubbling off something, kooky. And then, can anybody interpret that for me? That's my warped mind. But if you show the dream and the interpretation thereof, you shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore show me the dream and the interpretation thereof. They answered again and said, Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation of it. The king answered and said, I know of a certainty that ye would gain the time, because ye see the thing is gone from me. But if ye will not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you. Oh boy, here we go. You have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me till the time be changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me the interpretation thereof. That's really putting the stuff to the test. The Chaldeans answered before the king and said, There is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore there is no king, lord, no ruler that asks such things at any magician or astrologer or Chaldean. And it is a rare thing that the king require. This is an anomaly, king. You're asking for this. There is none other that can show it before the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with the flesh. Here's a good excuse, by the way. This is a fabulously crafted excuse. For this cause, the king was angry and very furious and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. And the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain. And they sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain. And Daniel answered with counsel and wisdom to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, which was gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. And he answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, Why is the decree so hasty from the king? Then Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. Then Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time, that he would show the king the interpretation. Then Daniel went to his house and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, his companions, that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. That's why I said it's important that we understand the connection of these words with the connection of what will be understood in Revelation regarding these same words, by the way. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. I love his whole mindset. He never says, hey, I did this thing. Look at how great I am. He says, this is of the Lord. And he changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise, and knowledge to them that know understanding. There's our bean word, by the way. He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who hast given me wisdom and might, and hast made known unto me now what we desired of thee. Prayer asked for and received, that thou hast made known now unto us the king's matter. Therefore Daniel went in unto Arioch, whom the king had ordained to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and he said thus unto him, Destroy not the wise men of Babylon, bring me in before the king, and I will show unto the king the interpretation. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and said thus unto him, I found a man of the captives of Judah that will make known unto the king the interpretation. The king answered and said unto Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, Art thou able to make known unto me the dream which I have seen, and the interpretation thereof? Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, The secret which the king hath demanded, Cannot the wise men, the astrologers, magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king? I love this. He says, but there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. As for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter. And that he revealeth secrets, maketh known to thee what shall come to pass. But as for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and that thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. Kind of interesting. Thou, king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image whose brightness was excellent. Some of this translation is terrible, but I just want to read tonight. I'm not going to take apart the text. Stood before thee, the form thereof was terrible. The image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms, his silver, his belly and his sides of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part iron and part clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, and no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth. This is the dream. And we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. So you asked for the dream. Here's the dream. Here's the interpretation. Thou, O king, art a king of kings. For the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field, and the fowls of the heaven, hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them. Thou art this head of gold, referring to the kingdom of Babylon. And after these shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. So we've covered this many times, probably in many different messages throughout the years, so you probably have notes in your Bible. For me, everything there is status quo. Babylon, the head, the second and lesser Medo-Persian. After that, you've got the Grecian, and then after that, the last portion, the Roman Empire. And these, by the way, we'll get into talking about these in a more historical way than simply just stating a matter of fact, because lots of times we talk about, Dr. Scott preached many messages on this, speaking about these kingdoms, but it's interesting, we can miss a few things. In studying the historical side, we find the gap between the Grecian and Roman. We can find gaps, which we'll talk about the gap theory. But also there's some other interesting historical things we should look at, and I'm going to try and find the right setting to do this, probably be here, when people who don't have the background of these territories will be left in the dark as to what this means in terms of territories when we begin to talk about the territories of Babylon, the Medo-Persian Empire that extends just a little bit more to the Grecian Empire that, if you think about it, went from the Indus and all the way far-reaching to the Hellespont, to the, we're talking about, you know, an extensive expanse. We'll call it the then known earth, but that's actually a misnomer because there were other parts of the earth that were known, but Alexander sat down, thought he had conquered everything, and began to weep, which is kind of interesting. And then the Roman Empire. And the Grecian and Roman Empire become very important when we begin to talk about last day events, obviously, because when we talk about the feet and the toes of this statue, lots of people make lots of mistakes about the far reaches of the Roman Empire, because as we know, the Roman Empire also extended, don't twist what I'm going to say, but at some point also extended to Britain, which is not included in that realm. And you've got to just take my word for it when we talk about the territory. We're talking about the territory that will represent the territory out of which the last days events, the Antichrist, have to do with, that pertain to those territories. So we'll get to that. As I said, I just wanted to read, and here I go doing sidebars. All right. So the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things. And as iron that breaketh all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. But there shall be in it the strength of iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part iron and part clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken or brittle, or there's many different ways to translate that word. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. And in the days of these kings, so sometimes you just read carefully and you find words you hadn't considered before. In the days of these kings, which refers back to the toes and to that, we'll call it loose confederate kingdom, whatever you want to call that. In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. For as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, and the silver, and the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter. The dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof is sure. I told you the dream, and I gave you the interpretation. And this is what's interesting. For people who are not familiar with this passage, this is why many people say this book must be at a later time, because Daniel is talking to Nebuchadnezzar at the time of Nebuchadnezzar, and he's looking far ahead to a future time, to things that actually the Medo-Persian Empire, and then the Grecian Empire, and then the Roman Empire, not yet. So I always want you to think about the back of your mind when you read in Revelation, where it says the things that were, the things that were, which are, and that will be. There's this interesting thing in prophecy that always has the same type of situation, which is for Daniel, speaking, interpreting the dream, and looking far ahead to a future time. Dr. Scott used to say about the mountain range, which I think was Larkin, that was Larkin's demonstration. Kind of a prophecy guy that was a little bit out there, but he used to describe it as, you know, you're looking at a mountain and you see the mountains, or you see mountains clustered together, but you don't see the valleys in between. So looking at it from the front, you just see what you see. But if you could take an aerial view and you could see that there are spaces in between, they're not all clustered together. This prophecy was prophecy when Daniel said it. It was not yet history. Now, for the most part, not all of it, of course, but the kingdoms as they are to the Roman kingdom, at least, to the Roman Empire, they already came and went. And then the toes, of course, are yet to be. And the kingdom, the stone kingdom, we'll call it that for right now, because that's, again, I'm opening up little doors. It's like, you know, when you go on the internet and you start looking for something, you keep opening up, popping up more windows. That's what I do here. I'm just popping up more windows. But he says, look, I told you the dream and I gave you the interpretation. Then the king, Nebuchadnezzar, fell upon his face and worshipped Daniel and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. I don't want to know about that. What type of reward is that? Sorry. The king answered unto Daniel and said, of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets, seeing that thou couldst reveal this secret. And the king made Daniel a great man, gave him many great gifts, made him a ruler over the whole province of Babylon, the chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. Then Daniel requested, this is what's interesting, Daniel requested of the king that he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. Now I always say this particular verse is interesting because he makes this request for his friends to be elevated to a position of prominence. And you would think it would be enough that everyone would know that these guys are with Daniel, right? But the king, Nebuchadnezzar, the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, 60 cubits tall, and the breadth was 6 cubits. And he set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Okay. Now, you know, this is, I'll just give you the overview here. Everybody's got to bow down and worship this thing. Everybody. And the 3 friends of Daniel, they refused to bow down. And these are the ones thrown in the furnace, right? Now, well, just hear me out for a minute. Often ask why they throw the 3 in. And okay, Daniel did a great thing and he told the dream and he gave the interpretation, but why didn't they throw Daniel in there? Why didn't they throw him in there? Some of you think I'm kooky. But the ones that came and they complained, saying, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, neither the golden image that thou hast set up. Nebuchadnezzar in his rage and fury commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, brought these men before the king, asked them if it was true that they wouldn't bow down. They said it was. And into the fiery furnace they're tossed. Now we tend to make this into a kind of Sunday school thing, you know. And there was a 4th man in the furnace, like unto the Son of God, or like unto the Son of Man. They weren't consumed, they weren't burnt, they came out intact. And I always think this passage has a lot more to do with a future concept than it does the event as it occurred, even though it occurred. Who are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Who are they? Well, they're with Daniel. They're obviously of the same, we'll call them Hebrew children, right? I'm using this carefully. I want to say there's always this distinction that's not made properly and then people go nutty. These refused to bow down and yet passed through great fire, and go so far to say the 4th man with them had to be the Lord in there. And I think, did this happen? I believe it did, but I also think that it's representing something also, we never look at this in a future way because it happened, and I think there's double fulfillment. And I think this very well could be a message for, forgive me for saying this, but now I have to use the word, to the Jews who in the midst of tribulation in the face of the earth, because some will be here, who recognize the Lord, will be saved. I think there's double fulfillment. I don't just think everything is just one straight plane of things. So when I read this, I'm careful to say I think there's 2 things at work. But there's all these very interesting, you know, if you can read between the lines, there's all these different interesting things. I'll read to where Nebuchadnezzar, I like it says in verse 24, 324, Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonied. Rose up in haste and spake, said unto his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, true, O king. And he answered and said, lo, I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire. They have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. You can say whatever you want, but, you know, read carefully, because I think everything in Daniel has some very relevant piece of information for what happened then and for some future fulfillment as well. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, spake, and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth out of the midst of the fire. Kind of interesting. They all gathered to look. They saw these men upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was a hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Kind of interesting. Therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss or a mister against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces. This king likes to cut things in pieces. And their houses shall be made a dunghill. His two favorite things, cutting in pieces and dunghill. Because there is no other God that can deliver after this sword. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Now, I'm going to just stop here for a second and say, you know, it's interesting. You get to see how eventually we know that Nebuchadnezzar has, we'll call it a dream and a meltdown, right? But eventually comes to, has not 7 years of insanity, but probably more like 3.5, and I believe it's probably 3.5 years of insanity. Then comes back to his senses. And for all of what it's worth here, so many diverse witnesses to the living God. Here's Daniel, who tells him the dream and the interpretation. Here are the Hebrew children tossed into the fire. They see the fourth and they don't burn. And he even says here, if anybody says anything about the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, cut you in pieces and make your house a dunghill. But still not enough in the context of what we're reading, still not enough to make this man turn and say, tell me, Daniel, tell me everything about your God. You notice that? It's somewhat interesting. And Nebuchadnezzar, to me, is very representational of many people, just like in the New Testament where, you know, thou almost persuadest me. There'll never be enough signs and miracles. There'll never be enough wonders. There'll never be enough proof for some people. So here's a good demonstration. I'm going to take a little break. When we come back, I'll continue on. I told you I was going to read tonight. Sometimes I just like to sit down and read with you and share bits and pieces. But I need you to make your reservations. I need you to make your commitments. And if you have done both of those, and get on the telephone, get every phone off the hook. Come on, get busy. So it kind of does make sense if Daniel's busy interpreting dreams to the king, that he'd do it in a language that he was more familiar with. Makes perfect sense. Nebuchadnezzar the king, unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. Kind of funny, I have the NIV opened up here, and kind of interesting translations of so much more colloquial or so much more less English, if you will. I'll keep reading in the King James. I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God hath wrought toward me. So he's acknowledging that God did this thing. But wait until he says, when he's referring to Daniel, he doesn't necessarily say that it's the God that's working in him, but the gods. How great are his signs, and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in mine house, and flourishing in my palace, whatever that means. Flourishing. I'm sorry, I got to see something here. Yeah, okay, well, NIV says, I was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. Okay, that's kind of weird. Flourishing. May you flourish. I saw a dream which made me afraid, and the thoughts upon my bed and the visions in my head troubled me. This guy's always seeing stuff. Maybe consider changing his diet. Therefore made I a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known unto me the interpretation of the dream. Then came in the magicians, astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers, and I told the dream before them, but they did not make known unto me the interpretation thereof. But at the last Daniel came in before me, whose name was Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, plural. And before him I told the dream, saying, O Belteshazzar, master of the magicians. That's why I said he still doesn't really kind of get it, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in thee. And no secret troubleth thee. Tell me the visions of my dream that I have seen, and the interpretation thereof. Thus were the visions of mine in mine head and my bed. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great, and the tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto heaven, and the sight thereof thereto, or thereof too, to the end of the earth. The leaves thereof were fair, the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all, and the beasts of the field had shadow under it, and the fowls of the heaven dwelt in the boughs thereof, and all flesh was fed of it. And I saw in the visions of my head upon my bed, and behold, a watcher, and an holy one came down from heaven. And he cried aloud and said thus, hew down the tree, cut off his branches, shake off his leaves, woo! Sorry, and scatter his fruit. Woo! Never mind. It's sometimes very difficult to read the King James and not, shake off his leaves and scatter his fruit, and let the beasts get away from under it, and let the fowls from under his branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump of his roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass, and the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. Be careful. Many people have thought that means 7 years, but 7 times is a number of completion, we know in the Bible. This matter is by the decree of the watchers, and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now thou, O Belteshazzar, declare the interpretation thereof, for as much as all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known unto me the interpretation, but thou art able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in thee. Then Daniel, whose name is Belteshazzar, you notice this is not necessarily first person speaking either, was astonied for 1 hour. And his thoughts troubled him. The king spake and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation thereof trouble thee. Belteshazzar answered and said, My lord, the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation thereof to thine enemies. The tree that thou sawest, which grew and was strong, whose height reached unto the heaven, and the sight thereof to all the earth, whose leaves were fair, and the fruit thereof much. And in it was meat for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and upon whose branches the fowls of the heaven had their habitation. It is thou, O King. Thou art grown and become strong. For thy greatness is grown and reacheth unto heaven, and thy dominion to the end of the earth. And whereas the king saw a watcher and an holy one come down from heaven, saying, Hew the tree down and destroy it, yet leave the stump of the roots thereof of the earth, or in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass in the tender grass of the field. And let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field, till 7 times pass over him. A complete time. This is the interpretation, O King, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king, that they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and they shall wet thee with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over thee, not 7 years, but a set time, a complete time, till thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. And whereas they commanded to leave the stump of the tree roots, thy kingdom shall be sure unto thee, after that thou shalt have known that the heavens do rule. Wherefore, O King, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee, and break off thy sins by righteousness, and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility. And this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months he walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. The king spake and said, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? While the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee. That's kind of interesting. Think about this. 12 months passed. He gave the interpretation. 12 months passed. And everything in this book, by the way, the numeric values are incredible. Don't get me started. I'm not even going to open that door up, because there's so many cool things that you just go, wow, okay, that's, never saw that before. The kingdom is departed from thee, and they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee, not 7 years. Just remember that. Until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men, did eat grass as oxen, his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. And at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven. It's interesting that there was a shift. You notice that it was Daniel, whose name is Belshazzar, and then we have another shift, by the way, and then here's another shift. At the end of days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me. His sanity came back to him, and I blessed the Most High. So see, at some point God can enter into even somebody like Nebuchadnezzar, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or say unto him, What doest thou? At the same time my reason returned unto me, sanity came back. And for the glory of my kingdom, mine honor and brightness returned unto me, and my counselors and my lords sought unto me, and I was established in my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added unto me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and whose ways judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase. So kind of stop right there for a minute. So when we talk about this, Daniel interpreted the dream, and a year passed before something came to pass. Now, if it weren't for that passage, we might just assume that this all happened right away. But a year passed, 12 months, and then the thing came to pass. And it came to pass exactly like that. And people always say the 7 times is not 7 years, but a complete God. When God works something over completely, usually does it in 7s. It's a complete season, a complete whatever that came upon him to the completion. And most people will say he was insane for a period of 4 years. I believe he was insane for a period of 3.5, because this whole book is divided into numbers that fit those particular 3.5, 12, 360, 25, 20. So anyway, we'll get to that another day, because I just don't want to open up the numbers thing. That's all I wanted to do tonight. I want to actually sit down and read through the rest of the chapters at another time, and probably once we get into the next chapter, which begins with Belshazzar the king, not Belteshazzar, Daniel, but Belshazzar the king, where you have a whole different thing that's going to take place. And if I can have somebody on my staff maybe remind me, I will bring in the Apocalypse of Daniel, which essentially weaves all these things together. It's somewhat of an older document, dated to, the late date for it I think is about 600. That's the late date for it. There's actually might be, yeah, the late date is 600. There may be an early date for it, and I just off the top of my head can't tell you. But we may read through that in conjunction with this, because it kind of crosses over and meshes something together between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar that kind of makes sense, which you don't necessarily get when you read the King James or even the Hebrew or the Septuagint. So maybe we'll do that next time. My goal for tonight is accomplished. We've at least looked at a short word study. We've pulled open the first part of the first verse of Revelation 1:1. And don't think that every single time I sit down here we're going to do the same thing. I believe in putting stuff out there, putting down information. Sometimes it'll just be reading. Sometimes we have to do the reading. But then at some point we have enough layers in our foundation we can begin to use those blocks to put things together. And you'll see how it's really just like learning Hebrew. Hebrew is a building block language. This is just like building blocks. You put a whole bunch of blocks together, and eventually you begin to see a structure take shape that is not something vague, but it has good form to it, and it's sound doctrine because it's repeated through and through, and we can confirm these things over and over again, which is what I'm interested in doing. I'm not interested in speculation. I'll tell you when I speculate, but not on these things.